Sebastian Carter stepped into the first-class cabin with measured steps. His well-worn leather briefcase clutched firmly in his hand. At 60 years old, he moved with a quiet dignity. His gray-white hair neatly combed. His posture upright but unassuming. His light gray suit, though tailored with precision, bore none of the flash that might hint at his wealth. To the casual observer, he might have been mistaken for a retired professor or a man heading home from a long day at an office job. And Sebastian preferred it that way. As he walked down the aisle, his gaze briefly met those of the passengers already seated. He nodded politely, offering a faint smile, but his focus remained ahead. Most people paid him no attention. Some glanced at him, a flicker of curiosity crossing their faces before they returned to their phones or magazines. It was a scene Sebastian had encountered countless times in spoken judgments masked by polite indifference. The kind of prejudice that simmered beneath the surface. Sebastian was not one to make a fuss. He never had been. Growing up in the segregated South, he had learned early on to navigate spaces that were not designed for people like him. Over time, he had learned how to defy expectations without ever raising his voice or drawing too much attention. Quiet resilience had carried him through years of struggle, leading him to build a thriving business empire. But even with all his success, there were moments, small, biting moments, that reminded him how far society had yet to go. Reaching his assigned seat, Sebastian placed his briefcase gently in the overhead compartment. Pausing for a moment to ensure it was securely in place, he eased into the plush leather seat, allowing himself a brief sigh of relief. It had been a long day of meetings, filled with decisions that could ripple through industries. The cabin hummed with quiet efficiency as flight attendants moved gracefully between passengers, offering drinks and assisting with bags. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" a young flight attendant asked, her tone polite but distant. "Just water, please," Sebastian replied, his voice calm and measured. The attendant nodded and moved on, leaving Sebastian to gaze out the small oval window. Outside, the airport bustled with activity. Ground crew directing luggage carts, planes taxiing to the runway, and the distant glint of sunlight reflecting off terminal windows. He watched for a moment before pulling out a book from his carry-on. Sebastian opened the novel, allowing the familiar rhythm of words to quiet his mind. He had long found solace in the pages of books, where the chaos of the world could be held at bay, at least for a while. But as he began to read, the faint tension he often felt in public spaces lingered at the edges of his awareness. It wasn't paranoia. Sebastian was too pragmatic for that, but the accumulated experience of years taught him to remain alert. The quiet didn't last. "Excuse me, sir." The voice cut through his thoughts like a cold wind. Sebastian looked up to see a flight attendant standing in the aisle. She was in her late 30s, with neatly styled hair and a uniform pressed with military precision. Her name tag read, Bethany Wilson. Her posture was rigid, her expression tightly controlled, but her eyes betrayed something sharper. "Yes?" Sebastian said, his tone even. "I believe you might have wandered into the wrong cabin," she said, her voice brisk, almost dismissive. "Economy is further back." A faint ripple of unease passed through the cabin. Nearby passengers glanced up, their curiosity piqued. Sebastian met Bethany's gaze, his face calm but unyielding. He had faced this kind of assumption before, the kind that questioned his presence in places reserved for those deemed worthy. "No, ma'am," he replied, his words deliberate and steady. "This is my seat." Bethany's brow furrowed. "May I see your ticket, please?" Sebastian reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and produced the crisp boarding pass. He handed it to her without a word. Bethany took it, her movements sharp and purposeful, as though she expected to uncover some mistake. She studied the ticket, holding it up to the light, flipping it back and forth as if she might find a flaw in its authenticity. The silence in the cabin grew heavier, the kind of silence that carried judgment, sympathy, and discomfort all at once. After what felt like an eternity, Bethany handed the ticket back, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It seems to be in order," she said, though her tone suggested reluctance. "But perhaps there's been a mix-up. This seat is reserved for first-class passengers." Sebastian held her gaze, his voice firm but calm. There's no mix-up. This is my seat. Bethany's cheeks flushed slightly, her composure cracking just enough for Sebastian to notice. She glanced around, as if searching for support from the other passengers. But none came. The others, perhaps sensing the undercurrent of tension, avoided her gaze, their eyes fixed on books, tablets, or the window. For a moment, the air between them seemed to freeze. And then, as if realizing she was losing control of the situation, Bethany's tone turned sharper. Sir, I must insist that you lower your voice, she said, though Sebastian hadn't raised it at all. You're disturbing the other passengers. The absurdity of the statement hung in the air. Sebastian blinked, his expression briefly betraying disbelief. Before he could respond, Bethany's hand moved faster than thought, landing with a sharp slap against his cheek. The sound was louder than Sebastian expected, ringing through the cabin like a dropped plate in a silent room. A collective gasp spread among the passengers. Sebastian sat very still, his cheek stinging, his thoughts momentarily scrambled. He raised a hand to touch his face, his fingers grazing the warm, reddened skin. Across from him, Bethany froze, her own hand trembling as if she couldn't quite believe what she had done. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Sebastian turned his head slowly to meet her gaze. His expression was unreadable, his calm exterior hiding the mixture of emotions swirling within him. He thought of the struggles he had endured, the battles fought and won. And here, in the quiet of this airplane cabin, he faced a new challenge. Not one of anger, but of choice. Bethany stepped back, her face pale as realization began to dawn. Sebastian took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had lived too long, endured too much, to let this moment define him. And yet, in the back of his mind, something shifted. There would be consequences. Not just for Bethany, but for the deeper currents that allowed moments like this to happen. For now, though, Sebastian said nothing. Instead, he turned back to his seat, picked up his book, and waited. The flight landed with its usual flurry of movement, passengers unbuckling their seatbelts, gathering their belongings, and shuffling into the narrow aisle to disembark. Sebastian Carter remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the armrests of his first-class seat. He watched the scene unfold around him, his expression calm but distant. Outside, the city's lights twinkled in the early evening sky, casting their faint glow on the airport's tarmac. Bethany Wilson moved swiftly through the cabin, her steps brisk, her gaze averted. She seemed determined to avoid meeting Sebastian's eyes, delegating tasks to her colleagues with clipped, hurried instructions. Her usual air of composed authority had been replaced by something tighter, more fragile, as though she was holding herself together by sheer will. Sebastian let her be. He had no intention of confronting her further. Not here. Not now. His composure wasn't an act of forgiveness, nor was it a retreat. It was a choice, a deliberate decision to let the weight of the moment settle into the spaces between them. Unspoken but undeniable. When the cabin had emptied, Sebastian stood, retrieving his briefcase with deliberate care. His movements were unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. He nodded politely to the remaining crew members, including Bethany, who managed only a stiff, perfunctory response. "Have a good evening," he said softly, his tone devoid of sarcasm or hostility. Bethany's lips moved as if to reply, but no sound came. Later that night, in the quiet solitude of his hotel room, Sebastian sat at the small desk by the window. The city stretched out before him, its streets alive with the hum of activity. He placed his phone on the desk and stared at it for a moment, his reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen. Sebastian had spent decades learning to navigate moments like the one on the plane, moments that cut deeper than any physical wound. He had learned to choose his battles wisely, to understand when to respond and when to wait. Tonight, he chose action. Unlocking his phone, he composed a message to his assistant. "Please coordinate with the legal team. Begin a discreet internal review of flight staff conduct. Starting with today's flight, ensure passenger feedback is included. I'll send additional details tomorrow." He paused, his finger hovering over the send button. Then, with a quiet exhale, he tapped the screen. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to the company he had just acquired. The airline was a recent addition to his portfolio. A purchase made not for profit but for its potential to impact lives. He had envisioned using it to set new standards in the industry: comfort, efficiency, inclusivity. But today's encounter had revealed cracks in the foundation. Cracks that hinted at a deeper, more insidious problem. The next morning, Sebastian arrived at the airline's headquarters unannounced. He preferred it that way. No grand entrances. No unnecessary attention. The building was a sleek structure of glass and steel, its reflective surfaces gleaming in the morning sunlight. Inside, the air buzzed with the energy of a corporate machine in motion, phones ringing, conversations in hushed tones, the steady rhythm of footsteps on polished floors. Sebastian met with his executive team in a private conference room. They were professionals, sharp and efficient, but as he outlined his concerns, he noticed a flicker of unease in their expressions. "Let me be clear," Sebastian said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about one flight or one incident. It's about the culture we're fostering, or failing to foster." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I've read the complaints. Passengers ignored, spoken to dismissively, questioned for no reason other than their appearance. These aren't isolated incidents. They're patterns." One of the executives, a woman with a sharp suit and an air of practiced diplomacy, cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, these issues are complex. We're dealing with human behavior, not policy that can be adjusted overnight." Sebastian nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand that, but complexity isn't an excuse for inaction. It's a call to do better." The room fell silent. Sebastian's next step was quieter, more deliberate. Over the following days, he began to observe the airline from within, speaking with employees at every level: ground crew, ticketing agents, flight attendants. His questions were simple, his tone conversational, but his purpose was clear. He wanted to understand the culture of the company he now owned. Bethany's name came up more than once. It wasn't always direct. No one was eager to openly criticize a colleague. But the patterns were there. Passengers of color frequently reported feeling overlooked or scrutinized. Older travelers often found themselves struggling with luggage while nearby staff remained preoccupied. Each observation added to the mosaic forming in Sebastian's mind. One late evening, as Sebastian sat in his office reviewing passenger feedback, he came across an entry that made him pause. It was a complaint filed months earlier, describing an interaction with Bethany. She didn't say anything outright. The passenger had written, "But you could feel it. The way she looked at us. The way she avoided helping. It's subtle, but it hurts all the same." Sebastian's gaze lingered on the words. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Prejudice wasn't always loud. It didn't always slap you in the face, as Bethany had done. More often, it was quiet, insidious. It hid behind polite smiles and professional tones, making it easier to ignore but no less damaging. Sebastian understood this all too well. He had lived it, not just in moments like the one on the plane but in countless interactions throughout his life. The whispered doubts, the lowered expectations, the invisible barriers that always seemed to rise in his path. But Sebastian had learned to endure. And now, with the resources and influence at his disposal, he intended to do more than endure. The next morning, Sebastian sent another message to his team. Initiate a company-wide review of employee training programs. Emphasize diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want actionable recommendations within the month. And schedule a meeting with our. This will be a collaborative effort. As he hit send, Sebastian allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. The work ahead would be difficult, but it was necessary. For Bethany, for the airline, and for every passenger who had ever felt unseen or unwelcome. This wasn't revenge. It was repaired, and it was just the beginning. Bethany Wilson walked into the break room of the airline's staff lounge with her usual confidence. Her uniform crisp and her steps brisk. Yet beneath her carefully composed exterior, she felt a strange unease, a faint but persistent tension that had been following her since that fateful flight with Sebastian Carter. She told herself it was nothing. A misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Perhaps, surely, it would fade with time. Yet the whispered conversations she noticed between co-workers and the sidelong glances they threw her way suggested otherwise. Bethany set her coffee cup on the counter. Her movements sharper than usual. She ignored the knot forming in her stomach as two flight attendants quickly ended their conversation and walked out the door. The unease followed her into the training session. The notice had arrived earlier that week. Mandatory Cultural Sensitivity Training. An internal initiative meant to address passenger complaints and improve employee conduct. Bethany had scoffed at the email. She'd been a flight attendant for over a decade, receiving consistent praise from supervisors and passengers alike. The idea that she needed a lesson on how to treat people felt absurd. But refusing wasn't an option. And so, she found herself in the company's training center, seated among colleagues in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers. The trainer, a woman named Mina, stood at the front of the room with a welcoming smile. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a warmth that immediately set most of the room at ease. Today, Mina began, we're going to talk about the small actions that can leave a lasting impact, positive or negative, on the people we encounter every day. Bethany leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. She listened with half an ear, her thoughts elsewhere. The session began with a short video. It depicted a series of everyday moments on an airplane. A passenger struggling to lift a bag into the overhead compartment. A parent with a crying baby. A man with limited English struggling to communicate his drink order. In each scene, the camera lingered on the flight attendants' responses. Some were kind and accommodating, while others were indifferent or subtly dismissive. The final clip showed a flight attendant ignoring an elderly woman's request for help, only to cheerfully assist a younger, more polished passenger moments later. The room was quiet as the video ended. Now, Mina said gently, let's talk about what we saw. What stood out to you? A few hands went up, and Bethany remained silent, doodling absent-mindedly on her notepad. It's not just the big moments. A younger flight attendant said. It's the little things. Who you choose to smile at. Who you take the time to listen to. Mina nodded. Exactly. Sometimes, prejudice isn't loud or obvious. Sometimes, it's subtle, a look, a tone, a hesitation. But for the person on the receiving end, those moments can feel just as painful. Bethany glanced at the screen as the video replayed a brief clip of the elderly woman struggling with her bag. She felt a faint tug of recognition. The scene reminded her of a moment she had witnessed, on the same flight where she had confronted Sebastian Carter. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. As the session continued, the group was asked to break into pairs for a role-playing exercise. Bethany reluctantly joined a colleague she barely knew. A quiet man named Daryl. Their task was to act out a scenario in which one passenger asked for assistance while another demanded immediate attention. Bethany sighed. I'd just prioritize the one with the more urgent need, she said flatly, eager to finish quickly. Daryl raised an eyebrow. And how would you decide that? Based on who they are, or what they look like? The question caught her off guard. Well, that's not what I meant, she stammered, a flush creeping up her neck. Daryl didn't press further, but his words stayed with her. By the time the session ended, Bethany felt drained in a way she couldn't quite explain. Mina wrapped up the training with a brief reflection exercise, asking each participant to share one takeaway from the day. Bethany hesitated as her turn approached. She felt the weight of the group's eyes on her, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. I guess, she began, her voice quieter than usual. I didn't realize how much small actions can matter. I'll think about that. It wasn't much, but it was the best she could manage. That evening, Bethany sat alone in her apartment, the glow of the television flickering across the room. She wasn't watching it, her mind was elsewhere, replaying the scenes from the training session. The video, Daryl's question, Mina's gentle but pointed observations. Bethany thought of the passengers she had encountered over the years. She thought of the moments she had dismissed as inconsequential. The hurried exchanges, the polite but distant smiles. And then she thought of Sebastian Carter. The memory of that flight was no longer just an isolated incident in her mind. It was part of a larger pattern, one she was beginning to see more clearly. Bethany reached for her phone and opened the company's employee portal. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the feedback section. Then, with a quiet sigh, she began to type. The next morning, Sebastian Carter sat in his office, reading a report from the training program. Among the entries was an anonymous note from a participant. I didn't think I needed this training. I thought I was doing my job just fine. But today, I realized there's more to it than following protocol. There's a difference between doing your job and making people feel seen. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The office at the airline's headquarters was unusually quiet. Sebastian Carter sat at the long, polished conference table, reviewing a stack of reports. The room was spacious, lined with windows that let in the soft light of the morning. But its openness only made the weight of the documents in front of him feel heavier. Each page carried a piece of someone's story: passengers who had written in with complaints, employees who had voiced concerns, and summaries of incidents that pointed to patterns of inequity. It wasn't the kind of work Sebastian had imagined when he first acquired the airline. But it was work he knew was necessary. One report in particular caught his eye. It detailed the findings of an internal review initiated after his own experience with Bethany Wilson. The conclusions were both illuminating and sobering. The review confirmed what Sebastian had already suspected. Bethany's behavior wasn't an anomaly. Her actions reflected deeper issues embedded within the airline's culture. Biases left unchecked. Attitudes formed by years of habit and subtle reinforcement. Sebastian sighed, setting the report down. He looked out the window, his gaze falling on the planes taxiing on the runway below. Each one carried its own set of stories, its own human moments of connection, or disconnection. Meanwhile, Bethany sat in the employee lounge, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She stared into the mug, her reflection distorted by the ripples in the liquid. She had completed the mandatory cultural sensitivity training, but it lingered in her mind. A quiet, persistent hum of unease. The sessions had been uncomfortable, not because of what was said but because of what it had forced her to confront. Bethany had always seen herself as a professional. She followed the rules, upheld the standards of first-class service, and prided herself on her work ethic. Yet the training had shown her something she hadn't wanted to see: the blind spots in her approach. The ways in which her assumptions had shaped her actions without her even realizing it. It wasn't an easy thing to accept. Her mind drifted back to the elderly black woman on the flight. The one who had struggled to lift her bag into the overhead compartment. Bethany had ignored her call for help, rationalizing it at the time as prioritizing other duties. But in hindsight, the memory felt heavier, weighted with the knowledge that she wouldn't have hesitated had the passenger been someone else. Bethany shook her head, trying to push the thought away. But it stayed, stubborn and unyielding. Later that day, Sebastian called a meeting with the airline's leadership team. They gathered in the same conference room where he had first outlined his concerns, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Sebastian stood at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but his gaze focused. I've spent the past few weeks reviewing the reports and listening to feedback. He began. What I've seen makes one thing clear. This isn't about a few isolated incidents. It's about culture. And culture doesn't change overnight. The executives exchanged glances, their silence speaking volumes. I want to be clear, Sebastian continued. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about accountability. We all have a role to play in shaping the environment we work in. He paused, letting his words settle. We're going to start by focusing on the small things. The interactions that seem insignificant but leave a lasting impression. The way we greet passengers. The way we respond to their needs. The assumptions we make, even unconsciously, about who they are and what they deserve. One of the executives, a middle-aged man with a furrowed brow, raised his hand. Sebastian, this sounds ambitious. But how do we measure something as intangible as culture? Sebastian smiled faintly. You measure it in stories. In the way people talk about their experiences, both passengers and employees. It's not always about numbers. Sometimes, it's about listening. Bethany's shift that afternoon was uneventful. But it felt different somehow. She found herself more attuned to the subtle dynamics of her interactions with passengers. The way they responded to her tone. The expressions that flickered across their faces. When an elderly man struggled to place his bag in the overhead compartment, Bethany moved without hesitation, lifting it into place with a quiet smile. "Here you go, sir," she said softly. The man looked at her, his face lighting up with gratitude. "Thank you, miss. That's very kind of you." Bethany felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pride or satisfaction. It was quieter, deeper, a sense that, for once, she had done something not just because it was expected but because it was right. Sebastian spent the evening drafting a message to all employees. He chose his words carefully, aware that they would set the tone for what came next. The message was simple. Change starts with awareness. Awareness grows through action, and action, when guided by empathy, has the power to transform not just our workplace but the lives of everyone we serve. As he hit send, Sebastian allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of his own journey. The countless times he had been underestimated, dismissed, or judged, and he thought of Bethany, whose journey was just beginning. Bethany, too, found herself reflecting as she sat in her small apartment that night. She thought of the passengers she had served, the colleagues she had worked with, and the moments she had let slip by without thought. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, change was possible. Not just for the airline, but for herself. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Bethany closed her eyes, letting the silence wash over her. It wasn't a conclusion. It was the beginning. The training center was quiet, its usual bustle subdued as Bethany Wilson entered the room. Her shoes clicked softly against the polished floor, the sound punctuating the stillness. A small circle of chairs had been arranged in the center, their placement casual but intentional. This wasn't a lecture or a seminar. It was something different. Bethany hesitated at the door, clutching her notebook like a shield. She had been asked to participate in a new pilot program designed to address employee biases. The program, called Reflections in Practice, required participants to share personal experiences, both as witnesses to and participants in moments of bias. It was not a request she could refuse. Sebastian Carter had insisted on keeping the group small. He believed in the power of honest conversation, but he knew it could only happen in an environment of trust. The participants included a mix of employees, flight attendants, gate agents, even a baggage handler. All had been invited to join after being flagged in passenger feedback reports. Sebastian sat quietly in a chair off to the side, his presence unobtrusive but steady. He was not here to judge but to listen. Bethany took a seat near the edge of the circle, her shoulders stiff. She kept her eyes on the floor, avoiding the gazes of her colleagues. A few faces she recognized, others she didn't. Mina, the program facilitator, began the session with a calm, welcoming tone. "Thank you all for being here. This space is for reflection, not blame. We're here to listen, to learn, and, hopefully, to grow." She paused, letting her words settle. "To start, I'd like to ask a simple question. Can you recall a moment when you felt judged unfairly? Or when you might have judged someone else too quickly? What did that moment teach you?" The room was silent for a long time. Finally, a young gate agent spoke up. He described an incident where he had been berated by a passenger for enforcing luggage size regulations. "I wanted to snap back," he admitted, his voice quiet, "but I realized she wasn't really mad at me. She was frustrated with her day." Still, it stung. Others began to share similar stories. A baggage handler recounted being ignored by passengers when offering assistance, while a flight attendant spoke about feeling underestimated because of her accent. When it was Bethany's turn, the room grew still again. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her notebook. She paused, her voice faltering. "I've been thinking a lot about the way I've treated people. Passengers, specifically." She looked up, meeting Mina's steady gaze before glancing at Sebastian. "There was a passenger on one of my flights," she continued, "an older black man. He was polite, calm, and didn't say much, but I assumed he didn't belong in first class. I questioned his ticket, doubted him, even though there was no reason to. Bethany's voice dropped, and she looked back down at her hands. I let my assumptions guide my actions. And when he stood his ground, politely. Mind you, I lost control. I embarrassed him. And myself. The weight of her words hung in the air. No one interrupted. Bethany swallowed hard, her next words barely above a whisper. I thought I was just doing my job. But now I see that it wasn't about the rules. It was about me. About what I chose to see. And what I chose not to see. Sebastian's expression remained calm, but inwardly, he felt a quiet satisfaction. This was the first time Bethany had spoken openly about the incident. And her acknowledgement of her actions felt genuine. Mina nodded encouragingly. Thank you for sharing that. Bethany, it takes courage to admit when we've made mistakes. What do you think you've learned from that experience? Bethany thought for a moment before answering. I've learned that my assumptions, about people, about their intentions, don't just affect me. They affect the way I treat them, the way they feel, and those small actions, they build up, they leave marks. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke. I can't undo what I did. But I can try to do better moving forward. I have to. The session continued, each story weaving into the next. Some were small, almost mundane moments, a misplaced word, a missed opportunity to help. Others were heavier, carrying years of frustration and hurt. By the end, the room felt lighter, as though the weight of their shared experiences had been set down. If only for a moment. Mina closed the session with a reminder. Change doesn't happen overnight. But it starts here, with reflection, with choosing to see the world and each other a little differently. That evening, Bethany returned to her apartment. The city's hum muffled by the quiet of her small living room. She set her notebook on the table and stared at it for a long time. For the first time in years, she didn't feel defensive about her actions. Instead, she felt something else. An ache. Perhaps. Or the first stirrings of regret. She thought of the passengers she had wronged. The moments she had dismissed as insignificant. And she thought of Sebastian, whose calm response to her worst behavior had done more to unsettle her than anger ever could. Bethany opened her notebook and began to write. Sebastian sat in his office that same evening, reviewing notes from the session. He read Bethany's words carefully, the memory of her voice still fresh in his mind. He didn't expect miracles. Change was a process, not an event. But as he closed his laptop and gazed out at the city, he allowed himself a small, quiet hope. It wasn't much, but it was a first step. The airline's conference room felt heavier than usual, the air thick with a sense of anticipation. The large windows framed a view of the airport, where planes taxied quietly on the tarmac. Inside, Bethany Wilson sat at one end of the long table, her notebook resting on her lap. She glanced around at the other attendees, fellow employees, supervisors, and a few passengers invited to share their experiences. This was part of the airline's broader initiative, a forum designed to bridge the gap between staff and the passengers they served. Sebastian Carter had insisted on its importance. We need to listen to each other, he had told his team. Not just speak. But listen. Bethany hadn't wanted to be here. She wasn't sure she was ready. But there was no avoiding it. Sebastian entered the room quietly, his presence commanding attention without effort. Dressed simply, his demeanor was calm and assured. He greeted the group with a polite nod before taking a seat near the center. Thank you all for being here today, he began, his voice steady and warm. This isn't an easy conversation, but it's a necessary one. We're here to understand. Not to accuse, not to divide. But to learn. He paused, letting his words sink in. I want to start by inviting our passengers to share their stories. These are moments we need to hear. The first to speak was an elderly black woman. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of her experience. She described a flight where she had struggled to lift her bag into the overhead compartment. I asked for help, she said, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The flight attendant looked at me, then turned away. It was a small thing. Maybe, but it stayed with me. It made me feel invisible. Bethany's chest tightened as she listened. The memory of a similar incident came rushing back. The same flight. The same dismissive glance. She remembered seeing the woman's quiet struggle and convincing herself she had more pressing duties. The woman's voice wavered slightly as she finished. All I wanted was to feel like I mattered. Even for a moment. Another passenger spoke next, a younger man who described being questioned repeatedly about his first-class ticket. It's not the questions that bother me, he said. It's the assumption behind them. Like I don't belong. Sebastian listened intently, his expression calm but thoughtful. He nodded as the man finished. His hands folded neatly on the table. This isn't about individual actions, Sebastian said after a pause. It's about the patterns we've allowed to form. These moments aren't isolated, they're connected. And it's up to us to break those patterns. When it was Bethany's turn to speak, the room grew quiet. She could feel the weight of their attention, the unspoken expectation that hung in the air. She hesitated, glancing down at her notebook. I wasn't sure what to say today. But after hearing these stories, I realize I need to say this. I've been part of the problem. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. There was a passenger, a man, on one of my flights. He was polite, calm, but I assumed he didn't belong in first class. I questioned his ticket. I doubted him for no reason other than what I thought I saw. She looked up, her gaze meeting Sebastian's, and I was wrong, not just in that moment, but in the way I've approached so many moments like it. I let my assumptions guide me. I let my biases speak louder than my better judgment. The room remained silent, but Bethany felt the tension begin to shift. I can't undo what I've done, she continued, but I can try to make things right. That's why I'm here. To listen, to learn, and to do better. After the forum, Bethany lingered near the back of the room, unsure if she should stay or leave. Sebastian approached her, his steps measured, his expression calm. You spoke well today, he said simply. Bethany managed a faint smile. I'm not sure it was enough. It's a start, Sebastian replied. Change isn't about perfection, it's about progress. And today, you showed progress. Bethany nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know if I can fix what I've done. The harm I've caused. Sebastian's voice softened. You can't change the past, Bethany, but you can shape the future. That's where your focus needs to be. In the days that followed, Bethany began to take small steps toward change. She volunteered to assist with a new employee training program, sharing her experiences openly with colleagues. The sessions were challenging. Her vulnerability often met with skepticism. But she persisted. During one session, a young trainee asked her a question that stopped her cold. How do you know you've really changed? Bethany paused, considering her answer carefully. I don't, she admitted, but I know I'm trying. I know I'm listening in ways I didn't before. And I hope that's a start. Sebastian, meanwhile, continued to oversee the airline's transformation from behind the scenes. He implemented policies that prioritized empathy and inclusion, from updated training programs to a new anonymous feedback system for passengers. Late one evening, as he reviewed the latest round of passenger feedback, a particular comment caught his eye. For the first time in years, I felt like someone saw me. Like I mattered. Thank you. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. There was still much to do, but this small moment felt like proof that change was possible. Bethany, too, began to notice subtle shifts. Passengers responded to her differently, their smiles warmer, their interactions more genuine. She realized it wasn't just about what she said or did. It was about how she carried herself, how she approached each moment with intention. One afternoon, as she helped an elderly man with his luggage, he turned to her and said, "Thank you, young lady. You're very kind." Bethany felt a lump rise in her throat. "You're welcome, sir," she replied, her voice steady. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: change, no matter how small, began with a single step. The training room was filled with the soft hum of conversation as a new group of employees settled into their seats. The chairs were arranged in a wide circle, fostering an openness that felt almost too vulnerable for Bethany Wilson. She stood at the front of the room, clutching a folder of notes she had carefully prepared the night before. For weeks, she had been co-leading the airline's cultural sensitivity workshops alongside Mina, the program facilitator. Each session was a mix of hope and tension, a chance to connect with others and to confront her own lingering doubts. Today, however, was different. This session was hers to lead. Bethany glanced at the clock on the wall. 5 minutes to begin. Her palms felt damp, and she fought the urge to smooth down her already perfectly pressed uniform. She caught sight of Mina in the corner of the room, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Good morning," Bethany began, her voice calm but quiet. The room gradually stilled as the employees turned their attention to her. "I want to start by telling you a story," she said, her gaze sweeping the group. "It's not an easy one to share, but I think it's important." Bethany paused, gathering her thoughts. "A few months ago, I made a mistake. I was working a first-class flight when I questioned a passenger about his ticket. He was calm, polite, everything you'd expect from someone who belongs in first class. But I didn't see that. I saw something else. Or rather, I let my assumptions guide what I thought I saw." She felt the weight of their silence as the group listened. "I treated him unfairly. I embarrassed him. And in doing so, I embarrassed myself." Bethany took a deep breath, steadying herself. That passenger was Sebastian Carter, our CEO. A ripple of surprise passed through the room. At the time, I didn't know who he was. But honestly, it wouldn't have mattered, because the real problem wasn't about him. It was about me. About the judgments I made before I even spoke a word. Bethany's voice softened as she continued. "I've spent a lot of time reflecting on that moment. It was painful to admit that I had let my biases influence my actions. But it was also the moment I began to see things differently. And that's what I want to talk about today. The small, subtle ways our assumptions shape how we treat others. And how we can change that." She walked over to a whiteboard and wrote 2 words in large letters: assumptions and actions. "Our assumptions aren't always obvious, even to ourselves," she said, "but they show up in how we act. In the tone we use, in who we choose to help, and in who we choose to ignore." Bethany turned back to the group. "Has anyone here ever caught themselves making an assumption about someone? Maybe without even realizing it at first?" After a long pause, a young woman tentatively raised her hand. "I've done it," she admitted. "I work at the ticket counter. And sometimes, if someone looks a certain way, like, if they're dressed casually, I assume they're in the wrong line for first class." Bethany nodded. "Thank you for sharing that. It's not easy to admit, but recognizing it is the first step." "What do you think happens when we act on those assumptions?" The woman hesitated. "I guess it makes people feel unwelcome, like they don't belong." The conversation deepened as others began to share their experiences. A gate agent spoke about how he had judged passengers based on their accents, assuming they didn't understand the rules. A flight attendant admitted she tended to offer better service to passengers who seemed important. Bethany listened carefully, her own mistakes fresh in her mind. "We've all made assumptions," she said finally. "What matters is what we do next. Are we willing to challenge those assumptions? To see people as they are, instead of what we expect them to be?" After the session ended, Bethany lingered in the room, tidying up stray papers and resetting the chairs. Mina approached her, her expression warm. "You did well today," Mina said. Bethany shook her head. "I'm not sure. It's hard to know if I'm really making a difference." Mina placed a hand on Bethany's arm. "You're sharing your story. You're showing them it's possible to grow. That matters." Bethany managed a faint smile. "I just hope it's enough." Later that evening, Sebastian Carter sat in his office, reviewing feedback from the training sessions. He read comment after comment from employees who had attended, noting their reflections on their own biases and the changes they wanted to make. One entry stood out. "Hearing Bethany's story made me realize how often I make assumptions without even thinking about it. I want to do better. Not just for our passengers, but for myself." Sebastian leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth lifting in a small smile. He thought of Bethany, of the journey she had undertaken. Her progress wasn't perfect. No one's ever been. But it was real. He picked up his phone and typed a quick message. Bethany, I reviewed today's feedback. You're making an impact. Keep going. Bethany received the message as she sat in her small living room, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. She read Sebastian's words twice, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and gratitude. She set the phone down and looked out the window. The city's lights glittered against the night sky, their quiet glow a reminder that even in darkness, there was always light to be found. Bethany knew she couldn't change the past, but for the first time, she felt certain about the path ahead. Change wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it was possible. One conversation, one action, one step at a time. The morning light streamed softly through the tall windows of the airline's headquarters, bathing the room in a warm glow. A long table stretched across the conference room, surrounded by employees from all levels of the organization, flight attendants, gate agents, managers, and executives. At the head of the table sat Sebastian Carter, his calm demeanor as steady as ever. Today marked an important milestone, the culmination of months of work to transform the airline's culture. This meeting wasn't about policy updates or shareholder reports. It was about reflection, a chance to measure the intangible progress they had made. Not through metrics, but through the voices of the people who lived it. Bethany Wilson sat toward the middle of the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She glanced around the room, noting the mix of expressions on the faces of her colleagues, some hopeful, some guarded, others quietly curious. Sebastian began the meeting with his characteristic clarity. Over the past few months, we've worked to address issues that go beyond what's written in employee handbooks or policy manuals. These changes haven't been easy. Change never is. But we're here today because each of you has played a part in this journey. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. This isn't the end, it's the beginning, and I want to start by hearing your voices. What has this process meant to you? What have you learned? A young gate agent was the first to speak. I've been with the airline for 5 years. He began, his tone thoughtful. I used to think I was doing everything right, following the rules, making sure things run smoothly. But I've realized that sometimes, it's not just about rules. It's about how we make people feel. Others chimed in, sharing similar reflections. A flight attendant spoke about the subtle ways she had learned to identify her own biases. A supervisor described how the anonymous feedback system had opened her eyes to issues she hadn't seen before. Bethany listened intently, her mind turning over the changes she had seen in herself and others. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, she began. This has been a humbling experience, she said, her voice steady but soft. I came into this process thinking I was just doing my job. But I've come to see how much I was missing. I didn't realize how my assumptions, however small they seemed, could hurt people. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of her colleagues. It hasn't been easy to face that. But I've learned that change starts with honesty, with admitting where we've fallen short. And it grows through action, through choosing every day to do better. Sebastian nodded as Bethany finished, a faint smile crossing his face. Thank you, Bethany, he said. Your willingness to share your journey has been a powerful example for all of us. He turned to the group. This work isn't about perfection. It's about progress. And progress requires all of us to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Later that afternoon, the airline held a small ceremony to recognize the efforts of employees who had gone above and beyond during the transformation process. The event was modest. Just a few speeches and refreshments in one of the larger meeting rooms. But the atmosphere was one of quiet celebration. Sebastian stood at the podium, addressing the gathered crowd. When we began this journey, our goal was simple: to create an airline where every passenger feels valued and every employee feels respected. It hasn't been easy, and we still have a long way to go. But today, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the progress we've made. And the people who have made it possible. He turned toward Bethany, who stood quietly near the back of the room. Bethany Wilson has been a part of this journey from the beginning. Her willingness to reflect, to learn, and to lead has set a powerful example for all of us. The room erupted into applause as Sebastian gestured for Bethany to step forward. She hesitated for a moment, then made her way to the front, her cheeks flushed with emotion. Sebastian extended his hand, and she shook it firmly. "Thank you, Bethany," he said quietly, "for showing us what growth looks like." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Bethany found herself sitting on a bench near the employee parking lot. The day had been long, but it had also been meaningful in a way she hadn't expected. She thought back to where this journey had started, on that fateful flight with Sebastian Carter. She remembered the sting of shame, the resistance she had felt, and the quiet determination that had slowly replaced it. Her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from one of the trainees she had mentored during the workshops. "Thank you for sharing your story with us. It helped me see things differently. I'll carry that with me." Bethany smiled, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and hope. In his office, Sebastian sat at his desk, reviewing the day's events. Outside, the city's lights twinkled softly in the night. He thought of the many stories he had heard, the progress that had been made, and the work that still lay ahead. Change was never easy, he knew, but it was worth it. He glanced at the photo on his desk, a younger version of himself, standing proudly in front of his first business. It had been taken decades ago, but the determination in his eyes hadn't dimmed. As he leaned back in his chair, Sebastian allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about one airline, one employee, or one moment. It was about something bigger, a belief that, given the chance, people could learn, grow, and create a ripple of change that extended far beyond themselves. The work was far from over, but tonight, he felt certain, they were on the right path. For Bethany, Sebastian, and everyone involved, this was more than a conclusion. It was a new beginning, a chance to build something better, not just for themselves, but for everyone they served. Above the clouds, the horizon stretched wide, a reminder of the endless possibilities ahead.